All right, I think we can get started, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Stephen Norris. I'm a professor of history at Miami University of Ohio, and I'm also the director of the Havighurst Center for East European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. It's a pleasure to see everyone here across multiple places here on a nice Friday afternoon in Ohio. I want to thank our co-sponsor, Lane Library, and Rebecca Smith, the director of Lane Library, for allowing people to join us live from the Havighurst room in Lane Library. And I also want to welcome Miami alumni. The word went out to Miami alumni and parents, so those of us joining from around the country and other places in Ohio, welcome. Uh, because of the multiple sites and the nature of this conversation, it would be best to, if you have questions, to type them into the chat. I will try to get to them as best as I can. This conversation is going to last about an hour. It's going to be an open flowing conversation with very important guests. And I'm really pleased to welcome and introduce Serhii Plokhy, who has been to Miami before. Uh, he is the Mikhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University. He was also the longtime director of the very famous Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute there. He is the preeminent historian of Ukraine and the nuclear age in the world. He's the author of 18 books. I've probably miscounted. There's probably 19 out there now, including, for today's purposes, Chernobyl, The History of a Nuclear Disaster, Atoms and Ashes, A Global History of Nuclear Disasters, Chernobyl Roulette, War in the Nuclear Disaster Zone, and most recently, The Nuclear Age, An Epic Race for Arms, Power, and Survival. We're going to talk a lot about Chernobyl and the nuclear age today. Welcome, Serhii. Always nice to see you.
Thank you, Steve. It's a real pleasure, and I really look forward to our discussion. As I told Professor Norris before, that discussion is my favorite format. So I look forward to hearing questions and also learning from those questions.
Great. So let's start with what I teased. This Sunday, April 26th, is the 40th anniversary of a disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near Pripyat, Ukraine, when the fourth reactor exploded, sending a radioactive cloud there that hits parts of Ukraine and also Belarus. I'm curious, before we talk about your book, what do you remember from that day? Where were you? How did you learn about the disaster? I remember particularly in America, I was 14, and I think the news hit the American news media outlets around April 29th, so just 3 days later. But I'm curious where you were,
Yes,
Sergey.
yes, that's also true for me. Living at that time in Ukraine, but at that moment also traveling, being outside of Ukraine. And the trick is that we learned at the same time as the Americans learned about the accident, maybe a little bit later. And I have no recollection of April 26, 1986, when it happened. But I remember exactly it's either April 29th or April 30th. I don't remember, but first the news were announced on the Soviet TV, radio, and in newspaper Pravda, and it's just a couple of lines. It's a very short information that an accident happened, and don't worry, everything is under control. So that was the message. But I remember also that it was so unusual that the Soviet authorities were informing us, uh, technically citizens, but really subjects of the regime, that there was an accident. Before that, no information was released whatsoever. And that control of information is something that really makes Chernobyl to stand out compared to accidents in other parts of the world. Three Mile Island in the United States, Fukushima later in Japan. So the authoritarian regime was in full control of information, and that of course was uh, one of the causes of the accident, but then also it contributed to the really political explosion that followed a few years later, the Chernobyl disaster.
I want to return to the impact of the disaster on the collapse of the Soviet Union, but I want to further ask a little bit more about the way in which the narrative was controlled within the Soviet Union and how people began to find out and how it moved from being don't be afraid to maybe we ought to be afraid. When did that shift and why?
Well, the news, apart from this very terse information coming from official sources, the news were coming two ways. First of all, there were rumors and people were talking to each other. And I remember that my professor at that time at the university, he came from Kiev, where he was undergoing some sort of relatively minor operation, and was telling us that the hospitals in Kiev were filled with people coming from Chernobyl area. And then okay, it's serious. It's really much more than what newspaper Pravda or Truth was telling us. And another was thank God for Cold War and for the Voice of America and BBC and Deutsche Welle, because they were telling us not necessarily always accurate information, but that was much closer to the truth than what the Soviet authorities were really sharing with us. And there was a big, again, generally people talk that Chernobyl really contributed enormously to this process of undermining trust in the communist regime. I would say that the trust was not particularly high at the moment, but what was high, the high was trust in Mikhail Gorbachev, the new Soviet leader, open, who was meeting with people. He just became the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which meant boss of the bosses, in March of 1985. Now, 1 year later, we have in a situation where we have to rely on the American government in the conditions of the Cold War to care about us, to tell us what precautions we should take, rather than rely on our own government. So that was really, really huge erosion of trust, not just in the regime, but also in Mikhail Gorbachev. I don't think that he really ever recovered from that blow delivered by Chernobyl and the way how the regime handled information.
So in your history of Chernobyl, as well as the history of the nuclear age, you do argue that there is a direct relationship between the erosion of trust and the collapse of the Soviet Union just over 5 years later. I'm curious if you can fill in the details. So it was 5 years between the Chernobyl explosion and the time, a little more than 5 years, when Ukrainians and other Soviet citizens took to the streets across 1991. So what happened from that erosion of trust to the summer of 1991
Right,
that
right,
led to the
right.
collapse and where there's a causal relationship?
Mhm. Yes, I'm not the first author who has been suggesting that there is a connection. But I am probably the first or one of the first who undertook the task of really documenting that and demonstrating exactly what that means and how it happened. And I'll explain that on the example of two key Soviet republics. One of them is Lithuania, another is Ukraine. Why they're key? They're key for the story that I'm now going to tell, to describe, is that Lithuania is the first Soviet republic that declares independence in March of 1990. Ukraine is the republic that puts the question of independence on referendum. And once referendum takes place in December of 1991, almost 2 years later, the Soviet Union is gone. It is dissolved within one week. So Lithuania started the process moving of republics toward independence, and Ukraine really completed it and made it reversible. Both in Lithuania and in Ukraine, the political mobilization starts over the issues of nuclear safety. For those of people in the audience who maybe watched HBO miniseries on Chernobyl, They were shooting the scenes from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the place in Lithuania called Ignalina. Ignalina nuclear power plant was really, the design was very similar. It was almost a twin nuclear power plant to Chernobyl. And it was after Chernobyl that the human chain that was created around Ignalina, protesting against nuclear power as the symbol of the central control imperial presence in the republic, which brings threat and nuclear contamination, and the center is not there to help. So that mobilization around Ignalina was the beginning of the Lithuanian Popular Front called Sąjūdis, and then it leads within 2 years, maybe in Lithuania, toward declaration of independence. In Ukraine, the first public manifestation, mass public manifestation, takes place in November of 1988, and it's on the issues of Chernobyl and ecology and nuclear safety. So the threat posed to the entire society by Chernobyl was so profound, and it was really affecting everybody, from the member of Politburo to the average worker to the average collective farm person, that the regime really couldn't really control information the way how it used to control. Gorbachev starts the policy of glasnost to openness a few months after Chernobyl, partially, not exclusively, but partially also out of response to this demand, tell us the truth about what happened. So it really opens the door that then the regime was never being able to close. Out of the movements in support of perestroika, like in Lithuania, in Baltic states, in Ukraine, emerged movements for independence of those republics. And again, Ukrainian example in that sense is very important. But as I just mentioned, in terms of Lithuania, you really didn't have to be a big chunk of your territory to be affected by Chernobyl. It's the threat, broadly speaking, that nuclear power presented that served as this mobilizing factor. Think, for example, about Fukushima and Germany going nuclear free a decade or so later. So Chernobyl really produced that effect, not just in Ukraine, but also in Lithuania and in other parts of the Soviet Union as well.
I'm struck by your answer, this excellent detailed answer that in your history of Chernobyl, you write that it's too easy in part to blame Chernobyl in 1986 just on the failed communist system and or the design flaws of the reactor in Chernobyl, and that we should take some different lessons. So, what are those different lessons that speak to the way you've just connected the dots between April 1986 and December 1991?
Yes, the biggest maybe lesson is about the issues of secrecy and about really openness with between the authorities and the industry and the society. And Chernobyl, partially one of the reasons for the accident is that not just the reactor had flaws, but also that the people who operated the reactor, they didn't have access to the full information about reactor and its potential weak spots. And one of the reasons why they didn't have that was that reactor was really of dual purpose. It could be adjusted and to produce plutonium or enrich uranium. And in that sense, it was top secret. And then what was happening after that, the government, of course, was trying to control information message by withdrawing information from the population as much as they could. The most bizarre moment for me was when I was working in Kyiv in the library of the Academy of Sciences, looking at the issue of the local Chernobyl newspaper, which was published on May 1st, 1986. By that time, half of the city was already evacuated. But the newspaper that celebrated May the 1st, the International Day of Solidarity of the Workers all over the world, had no one single line about what was happening in the neighborhood. So that newspaper for me is a symbol of this really denial of information. So inability to tell truth about what is happening there. And this is story very Soviet, but I think it also applies to the way how we as humans deal with potential nuclear accidents, potential nuclear threats, no matter where we are. Today, we are very much count on nuclear as part of the solution to the climate change. And one thing that those who promote nuclear energy refuse to talk about is that accidents do happen. These are very complex systems. We are on the verge of getting a new type of modular reactors online. Any new technology goes through the period of screw-ups and all sorts of accidents. So we expect, or people who promote nuclear energy expect us to think that the reactor meltdowns are in the past, that nothing of that sort can't happen. And then each time that happens, you have the entire nuclear industry being frozen for at least 20 years. So in the United States, after 3 Mile Island, for more than 30 years, there was no approval of one single reactor. So that is because whoever promotes nuclear industry doesn't want us to think that, okay, like getting into the car, launching new reactor, that means that you are prepared to take risks, that accidents do happen, and not only on the road, not only automobile accidents, others as well. And I don't think that we are there. We don't fully understand the risks of nuclear industry, and I'm not pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear. But without understanding the risks, you really can't be effective in terms of providing safety measures. And then not understanding the risks, you are going into a different direction, a sort of a panic, and really shut down the entire industry for a long period of time. So that's issue of truth, of openness, of understanding, of realization of the risks, but also of potential of nuclear industry. That's for me the biggest lesson from Chernobyl that I can take out of Chernobyl, out of Ukraine, out of Europe, and really talk about the global lesson that comes from that largest nuclear disaster in the world so far.
I want to pick up on a very pertinent contemporary issue in a moment. And I also want to remind the audience that feel free to type a question into the chat, and I'll try to get to them at the end of our conversation. But first, you did mention the HBO series Chernobyl. I think that's now the primary entryway many people have toward the nuclear disaster in 1986. Certainly my students and other people at Miami, that's how they learn about Chernobyl. Legasov is a major figure in your history of Chernobyl. You even write about him that he had to walk a fine line at the time. He was a romanticist. He was a poet. He wanted to be a writer. He ended up working in the nuclear industry. He was played by Jared Harris in the HBO series. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the series and how well it tackles the issues you've just talked about, and especially the character of Legasov, who's so central to both your history and the
Yes.
series.
Yes. Again, I sort of once the series were released, I publicly somewhere said that, well, they're so good that they soon will replace quote unquote truth. Whatever happened there, the truth will be the HBO miniseries. And the key theme in the miniseries is also the theme that I just discussed. It's about the truth, right? And how you handle that, and how the government was trying to withdraw it. This is the most, in terms of the accuracy of portrayal, uh, probably the best production on the late Soviet period that was produced anywhere outside of the former Soviet Union, within the Soviet Union. The attention to detail of what people were wearing, how people looked like, what cars were there, what sort of. So that's really amazing. I think they're also, this is small truths. They're also very good at telling the big truth about the system that really failed its citizens by withholding the information. But by getting from small truths to the big truth, they cut a lot of corners and and produce a lot of things that are not accurate. For example, you have a scene where there are the KGB officers marching into the room and arresting someone and taking him away, which is bizarre thing. That's was not happening in that way and in that form. What was there was certainly concern about the KGB being everywhere and certainly watching every step and concern about that. So they present that through visuals, which are not. They present the true situation through really imagined particular episode, and this is true for Legasov as well. So he is portrayed there in the really very rundown apartment, which is again everyone who lived in the Soviet Union at that time realized this, okay, this is not the case. He was part of the elite, part of the academic elite, which was doing very well in terms of the economically, financially, and otherwise. They also bring him to testify at the trial at the end to explain us also what was the technology behind the RBMK reactor. He never went to that trial. He never was there. So there is a lot about, and this is just an example of Legasov where appearing in the places where he never appeared, behaving in the way he never behaved, trying to hide some tapes from tape recorder. He didn't have to do that. But I think for majority of the viewers, and that group is growing of people who were not there, not at the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union in 1986, that really conveys a lot of in this imagined scenes conveys a lot of basic truths about the society. So it's a complex phenomenon really to put just at the plus or minus and to give it assessment either exclusively positive or exclusively negative.
I almost set you up there, Serhii, right? We historians are the ones that ruin movies for people who enjoy them. But I too thought Chernobyl was really well done. I like the way you said it captures the big truths, even while, of course, because it's a mini series, has to sacrifice some
To
small truths.
dramatize, yes,
Of
yes.
course, right. It reminds me in your book about Chernobyl roulette, which I'll ask more about in a second, that you described the effects of the Chernobyl miniseries in Ukraine itself, especially for Chernobyl tourism. So can you talk a little more about the prior to 2022, of course, but the Chernobyl tourism that boomed in Ukraine as a result of the series?
Right, right. Well, once the miniseries were there, I was really very concerned about the way how the public would perceive it, because if Legasov is a positive character, they have also some people whom they vilified. The guy called Bryukhanov, who was the director of the nuclear power plant, who generally was actually loved by his people. And when the miniseries were released, he was alive. He got a high level of radiations. The Soviet Union put him on trial. He spent some time in prison. So really a martyr of a sort of the way how the government treated the entire situation. And I was concerned about how he and people around him would deal with this not truth as the way to get to the big truth. And the original reaction actually from the so-called liquidators and operators was very positive. And it was positive because the mini-series really reminded about the world, about them, about their tragedy, so on and so forth. By now, it's mostly negative. Okay, they didn't portray Brikhanov correctly and rightly, but originally I expected negative from the start go, and it wasn't. President Zelensky at that time, after mini-series, gives a word of the hero of Ukraine to the two, there were three at that time, I don't remember whether were two still living or not, but to the people who were very important in the going underwater, opening some gates under the water and saving in that sense situation. So the public in general learned about Chernobyl. So there was a period of really the number of people, and mostly from outside of Ukraine, coming to Chernobyl was increased dramatically. And then came COVID. And my book on Chernobyl Roulette, I started with the post of the owner and director of the largest tourist operator in the Chernobyl zone, who is sending in early 2022. So it looks like COVID is sort of receding into the past. And he says that they're hiring new tour guides. And a few days later, he says, okay, we don't know what will happen because everyone expects the war. And the tourist season in 2022 doesn't happen. So there is a lot of people from outside of the Chernobyl zone in the zone, but they come on heavy equipment. They wear Russian uniforms, and this is invasion. So really now we are talking about more than 6 years of Chernobyl zone being either inaccessible because of COVID or because of war. A huge, of course, a huge disappointment for people in the zone. Outside, a huge blow to whatever business component of that tourist infrastructure was. And that's where we are, and we don't know when the war will be over, when Chernobyl will be opened. But once it will be opened, it will be not just about Chernobyl 1986. It will be also about Chernobyl 2022, about the nuclear sites at the time of the war. For the first time in history, an invading army takes over a nuclear site. It will be about the nuclear sites and the drone warfare, because the Russian drone attacked the multi-billion-dollar shelter over the fourth reactor, punching a huge hole there, endangering the entire situation. So now millions and millions of dollars are needed really to repair that. So Chernobyl, unfortunately, keeps producing more food for thought and becoming a symbol of all sorts of danger associated with the nuclear, from the situation of secrecy, over dependence of nuclear industry, or the military design of the reactors, and now to the warfare, including drone warfare in the region. But again, that's like Chernobyl 86, Chernobyl 22, and Chernobyl 26. It's a global issue, a global problem.
You perfectly anticipated my next question. So it might surprise audience members to learn that Chernobyl had a tourist boom for a while because of the HBO series. Maybe not everyone knows or knew that Chernobyl is still an operating nuclear power plant. And as you mentioned, Serhii, in 2022, Russian troops seized it. It's the subject of your recent book, Chernobyl Roulette. And also the Zaporizhian nuclear power plant is still under threat. So can you talk a little bit more about especially the occupation of the Chernobyl nuclear plant
Right.
in
Right.
2022 and what what went on there and what lessons we can draw from that, aside from the very grim one of the fact that now nuclear power plants can be used in wars as potential dirty bombs.
Right, exactly, exactly. Chernobyl in 22, when the occupation happened, was a particular place. The last reactor was shut down there in the year 2000, but it needed a lot of people really to operate the site. And there were people who were needed to operate the shelter over the fourth reactor. And then there were people needed to operate water pools and storage for the nuclear fuel and assemblies, nuclear fuel assemblies from the reactors that were shut down back in the 20th century. So Chernobyl as operating reactor is part of history of the 20th century. But you need people in the 21st century to deal not just with the disaster of Chernobyl, but also with the products of the spent fuel that is being produced by any reactor. And then they were turning it into a different sort of storage from into the dry storage facilities. So the electricity that was spent by Chernobyl, and for that matter, by any reactor in the world, is already consumed. But we are still paying price for that electricity, even if it is not the story of a particular nuclear site and nuclear power plant ended successfully without accident. You have to take care of all these things. And once you have the Russian occupation, it's really impossible dilemma for people who work on the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl in particular. What the question that they have to answer is, what is loyalty and what is betrayal? If you see a tank approaching your building and the Russian army moves in, what is the right thing to do? Should you fight back? And there are close to 200 members of the Ukrainian National Guard who are really placed there to deal with all sorts of stalkers and terrorists, but not with the army. Or you should lay down weapons and in that way preclude the threat of the warfare on the nuclear side and another nuclear accident. And there is no Ukrainian law, there is no international law which tells you what to do, whether you are in what situation you are really loyal to your country, to your homeland, to your family, to the humankind, in what situation you are betraying it. And the Ukrainian operators responded, and the members of the National Guard responded differently. In Chernobyl, they decided to lay down weapons. They were arrested, became prisoners of war, mistreated, sent to Russia. A few weeks ago, there was another exchange between prisoners of war, and some of the people who were taken as prisoners of war in Chernobyl came back to Ukraine. Others are still staying there. So once that information spread to other nuclear power plants in Ukraine, in Zaporizhia, you mentioned it, this is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, located in southern part of Ukraine. When the Russian troops moved to Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, the Ukrainian National Guard units, they were not equipped to fight with the tanks, but they decided to fight back. And there was a battle taking place with the missiles being fired on the territory of now operational nuclear power plant. Not the one that was shut down back in 2000, but still the one that was still producing electricity. And one of the Ukrainian engineers put the feed from this surveillance cameras to the station's YouTube channel. And the entire world was able to see in real life the battle on the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. One of the buildings caught fire. One of the reactors was damaged. Uh, I have a chapter in this book which called by God's grace. So indeed, by God's grace, another accident didn't happen, didn't take place. So we are in the new world with the reactors now being under attack. And whatever the imagined line that existed in our minds between atoms for war and atoms for peace doesn't exist anymore. And as Steve, you said, I agree absolutely that, again, the potential of turning these nuclear sites into dirty bombs is extremely high. And when people talk about nuclear threats in the war in Ukraine or potential wars in other parts of the world, I think they miss a key point. Most of the time they think about nuclear weapons. They imagine Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the much more immediate threat is the turning of the nuclear power plants in Ukraine in particular into dirty bombs. And for that to happen, you don't even need a direct attack on the nuclear power plant. You need a situation that already occurred dozens of times around Chernobyl and Zaporizhia. That's when warfare in the region cuts the electricity supply lines. This nuclear power plants, they're not operating. They don't produce electricity now in the conditions of the war. So to keep safety system working, they need electricity from outside. If they don't get electricity from outside, you get Fukushima. Fukushima came into existence because there was no the tsunami and then earthquake, mostly earthquake rather than tsunami, destroyed the power lines that were bringing electricity to Fukushima, and then reactors one after another melted down because there was no electricity to come into the pumps. The pumps were not pumping water. The cold water was not cooling the overheated reactors. So that is again a huge issue and huge problem for Ukraine. But one, as anything related to Chernobyl, anything related to nuclear industry, it's a global challenge.
Your books are always eye-opening to me, Serhii, and that was particularly true of reading Chernobyl Roulette for this precise reason. I knew, of course, of the occupation of the Chernobyl plant in 2022, but I hadn't thought through the choices individual people made in that occupation, as well as the larger threat that just the fact that an army was willing to take over a nuclear power plant is quite scary. You mentioned a couple minutes ago that we should see Chernobyl on a timeline, that there's Chernobyl 86, Chernobyl 2022, and now Chernobyl 80 or 2026, which seems like a good segue for a couple maybe last questions from my part, and then some audience questions. And that is your about your most recent book, which is a history of the nuclear age itself. So we can expand outward even to think about where Chernobyl fits on this larger timeline, because it is, of course, part of the larger history of the nuclear age. And we know the nuclear age and the atomic weapon was born in the midst of World War II and expanded, of course, during the Cold War. But it grew out of interwar between World War I and World War II, scientific, political, and cultural concerns. So, can you tell us a little bit about it? I was really struck in the book by how much you spend time with the people, the scientists, where they came from, where they ended up, what the concerns were after World War I in regards to splitting the atom or achieving nuclear fission, to kind of recover that historical part of things.
Yes, one thing that I discovered for myself is that we held scientists in high regard, and for very good reasons. They're smart people. They work hard to achieve their goals, and sometimes they able to serve as moral authority and example. But equally as many times, they really fall really short of that. And you mentioned won, and the scientists working, some of them Nobel Prize winners in physics and chemistry, they all mobilized to produce poison gas and other horrible things for their for France, for Germany, or something like that. They were one international community, close knit. They spoke the language that only they understood. Then comes the war, they serve their governments, they produce horrible things, and the war ends and they reunite. And they keep awarding each other Nobel Prizes because what matters is basically what they did for science. And in that sense, the drive toward the splitting the atom, discovering the atom, move to the nuclear bomb is very much driven by personal ambitions of the scientists. But they also realize what potential threat their discoveries can produce. And what you have is the group of scientists in Germany, in Europe. At that time, of course, interwar period, Nobel Prize winners, 85% were coming from Europe, not from the United States. US was backwater in that sense. And a lot of them, they have to leave Germany because Nazism is there. And then Nazism is spreading, and they're going to the United States. And they're really terrified about the idea of the Nazi atomic bomb. And they start lobbying the American government quite successfully. And by 1944, some of them realize that US is getting the bomb, but the Germany will be destroyed by conventional ways, before the bomb is there. And they now start to lobby in the government actually not to use the bomb. So this really changes and transformations, and this is a story of someone who is really releasing a Frankenstein, and then has responsibility for that, and loses control over his or her own invention. Because at the end of the day, it's the governments who fund the project and the governments who own the final product, the Frankenstein, and then do one thing or another. So really, I took another look at my own world. Again, I'm not scientist. I'm in humanities, social sciences, but generally, we go to the same places called universities. We interact with each other, and it was a very interesting perspective on my own community, this broader community.
You correctly guessed where I was getting with that question because I too was struck by that. You really get inside the hallways and the personal rivalries, but also, as you mentioned, the fear factor, which I want to ask you to expand on a little more. Initially, the atomic project was born out of fear another colleague might outdo you and your lab. And then it was primarily born out of the fear that Nazi Germany might develop an atomic weapon. And all the refugees that had fled from Germany to America saw that as their really their primary emotion and why they did what they did to building this Frankenstein's monster. And you use that idea of fear to describe almost the entirety of the atomic age, that it is a factor that was there from the beginning and remained to the present day. So how so? Maybe you can say a couple more words about that.
Yeah, we are in this very, very dangerous and fearful world because of fear. Fear brought us here. The Germans in German science was leading in nuclear research. And one of the reasons, there are a number of reasons why they didn't get the bomb first, was because they were so sure that they were so superior in terms of their physics and nuclear physics to everybody else. They didn't need to fear anybody. But the British were very fearful, and they started the first real research. And then after Pearl Harbor, Americans became quite fearful as well. And the idea was that they were building bomb because they couldn't stop Germany building the bomb. So the idea was immediately of deterrence. If we have a bomb, somehow we can act what can come from Germany. So the idea of nuclear weapons as a deterrence was born even before the nuclear weapons were born. And then every other country really tries to build its own bomb predominantly out of fear, not exclusively, but predominantly out of fear. There is endless discussion about President Truman approaching Stalin in Potsdam in summer of 1945 and telling him that we got this really very, very powerful weapon, and Stalin is not reacting to that. And the discussion is whether Stalin was such a great actor or what that really meant. Given that the Soviet spies provided very, very thorough information on the Manhattan Project, and that's the project that built the bomb and what was happening there. The truth is, the way how I at least understand it, is that yes, Stalin knew about the nuclear project, but he just lacked imagination. Like Hitler, by the way, lacked imagination in terms of thinking what it might be. And that problem for Stalin was solved by Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And after that, the Soviet Union does everything possible to build the bomb. And the Chinese build their bomb, of course, out of fear of the American bomb first, and then later of the Soviet bomb. And Israelis have built their bomb and don't admit that, not in response to the nuclear threat, but in response to potentially overwhelming armies of its neighbors. And India builds bomb because of Pakistan, and Pakistan builds bomb because of India. And you can continue. There are other factors as well. Apart from fear, there is the elements of prestige. British and France get their bombs to partially maintain their great power status in the conditions when they lose empires in the late 50s and early 60s. But fear still remains to be the driving force. And it's the big question of the nuclear age, and now we are getting into AI age. Is how to manage our discoveries and how to turn also fear of the other guy having superior weapon into something that can produce what sort of a balance of fear, because all the ideas about getting rid of nuclear weapons or somehow trying to limit the development of AI are, in my opinion, are doomed. They're wonderful ideas. They're extremely naive ideas. All mobilization to get rid of nuclear weapons, create world government to use UN regulations failed. The only thing that worked really was unfortunately, the world based on fear. In the context of the Cold War, the mutually assured destruction, where you are not using your weapon, whether it's nuclear, AI powered weapon or whatever it is, because there are also other guys who have that, and that's a restriction on your actions, the response that you can get for that. And again, but out of fear, you can also do basically things that are not logical and produce the crises, including nuclear crises, that you wouldn't produce otherwise. So I wish I could provide some kind of a more assurance and say that, okay, we as human beings, we can be rational rather than emotional, responding to fear. But we are still driven more by emotions than by our power of reason.
But I mean, there's many more things I could ask you, although I do like in the book, if like is the right word, how you describe that sometimes fear led citizens to mobilize and form organizations like SANE, Norman Cousins'
Exactly.
organization. And that too holds governments in check sometimes. There are two
Yes.
questions in the chat. I'd like to ask them, and then if we have time, maybe there's a one more question I can ask you. So Nathaniel has asked about, besides the HBO miniseries, have you seen or watched any of the other depictions of the Chernobyl disaster in popular culture? So he cites this documentary-style TV series Zero Hour, which was filmed on location. And if so, what are your thoughts on other series or popular depictions of Chernobyl?
Yes, I didn't see that particular production. I saw a number of others, and that was called the Chernobyl Woodknacker or something like that. The and Babushkas of Chernobyl and others. There is a tendency also present that place a little bit like Jurassic Park, of course, with strange animals running around and nature taking over, and generally paranormal things happening there. So there is that tendency. But there are also really productions that raise again questions that are important for Chernobyl and zone, but also globally important for us. There were two productions of documentary films on the occupation of Chernobyl. And one of them I want to, it's a longer something going over 1 hour, but completely the film that is produced out of the footage from the surveillance cameras during the occupation, without using language but using music and showing what is happening there. And for me, that was almost more frightening to a degree than the works where there are also computer games, right, where the Chernobyl zone is imagined as something full of I don't know, creatures, imagined creatures, and where paranormal things are happening. So yeah, I watched some of them. I didn't watch others. I still believe that HBO miniseries probably the closest to the big truth about Chernobyl, Chernobyl zone than anything else that I saw so far.
Yeah, I watch Russian propaganda, so you all listening don't have to. There was a Russian TV show called Liquidators that was produced on the orders of the cultural minister of Russia, Vladimir Medinsky, in response to the HBO miniseries because it was deemed in Russia that this denigrated the heroes of the Soviet Union, and so there needed to be a series to react to it. I would not advise watching that. I would definitely advise
I
watching the
read
HBO.
about that and I didn't watch it. And it seems to me the main character there, he saves the world from the CIA that actually is responsible for the Chernobyl.
Correct. Correct.
Okay, okay,
Yep.
okay.
The
So
ultimate
yeah,
sacrifice. Yep.
I don't recommend anyone to watch that, but I have to.
Yes, yes. So we have a question from Maggie too. It's about Chernobyl today. She wants to know if there are still statistics or research projects being collected on those who developed cancers or other major health concerns in the as a result of the explosion in 1986. And if so, is it focused on those nearest to Pripyat or also those in neighboring countries are exposed? I mean, Belarus, of course, was hit pretty heavily. I don't know the state of research on childhood cancers there now, so
Yes.
perhaps you can speak to that.
Yes, we are in a situation where we can go to Hiroshima, and I did that, and watch there the building that is a symbol of the attack, and it's not restored for a good reason as a reminder. But around that, you see the really wonderful city with a lot of people and very modern city and children and everyone is playing around and enjoying themselves. You go to Chernobyl, you don't see that. And you will not see that probably for another couple of generations. So the damage that Chernobyl did to the area around and made it impossible for people normally to live there is significantly higher than what Hiroshima and Nagasaki produced when you look at that from the perspective of one generation, 2, 10, 20, 30 years. And that damage is produced not by the release momentarily of huge amount of radiation, but release of the limited number of radiation over a long period of time, lower dosages of radiation. And we know a lot about the impact of the nuclear bomb because a lot of research and money went into that as the world was preparing for another nuclear war. And we know very little about the impact of low dosages of radiation working over a long period of time, partially because the responsibility for the research was with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which mandate is to promote the development of nuclear industry. There are other reasons as well, but this is a long way to tell that we know very little till today. For a long period of time, the consensus in the medical community, people who studied the impact of Chernobyl, was that there was nothing or very little that they can attribute to Chernobyl per se. And only in the 1990s, there was irrefutable data about the thyroid cancer among children, thousands and thousands. The good thing that thyroid cancer is relatively easy to diagnose and operate on. So silver lining, but other than that, that's and till today, this is the only consensus that exists that I know about, and this is the impact on the children. To figure out whether the people, especially people who lived in Chernobyl zone and then went all over Ukraine or the Soviet Union, or were the clean-up workers, so-called liquidators, and then went to whether they got cancer, let's say if they got cancer 20 years from the accident, whether it is related to Chernobyl or not, that's big unknown. But the latest data that now comes from Ukraine, including on the occasion of 40-year anniversary, suggests that, well, we have the high chances of really the pregnancy not going right or interrupted pregnancy among the women in the region because of Chernobyl radiation. And these levels of radiation are detected in their bodies. And the reason why it is there, it's interesting. It's not because they were exposed to the radiation back in 1986. Those women were not born in 1986. But if they go and in the conditions of the war in particular and shortage of the food, clean food and clean water, and consume berries or consume mushrooms from that area, that's where they get the radionuclides, and that's where they get radiation, and then radiation also has negative impact on their chances to go through the entire pregnancy process and give birth to a healthy child. So this is reporting from a few weeks ago. So again, you didn't have even to be born in 1986 for your children to be still affected by what happened in Chernobyl in 1986.
Yet
Unfortunately.
another reminder, Serhii, that Chernobyl is still with us, not 40 years later, and so too the issues of the atomic age and the ways in which it unfolded across the century. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Serhii. I could
Thank
talk
you. Thank you,
even
Steve.
longer. I I am even more pleased to listen to your insights. They're remarkable. And absolutely recommend everyone tuning in today at Lane Library, online, everywhere else. Pick up one of Serhii's books. The Nuclear Age is the most recent one. Chernobyl Roulettes. Atoms and Ashes, and of course, Chernobyl, the history of a nuclear disaster. So thank you very much,
Thank you,
Serhii.
Stephen. Thank you to Miami University. Thank you to the library, and thanks, guys, for finding time to attend events like that.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.